Welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT how to play video. Today our analyst will be going over one of the current top meta builds, Mech Infiltrator. This video will be breaking down the core items, core champions, and dive into each stage of the game. With that said, let's get into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. All right, time to get back to the video, and to begin, let's go over the core items for Mech Infiltrator. There's 3 different ways you can itemize this composition. The Super Mech will be given defensive items, Shaco will be given physical damage items, and Kaisa gets magic damage and utility items. How you decide when and how to distribute those items is mostly up to what drops for you in the PvE rounds. If you're getting a lot of swords, then it's best to stack items on Shaco, but regardless of which carry you stack, it's always important to have at least 2 defensive items on your Super Mech. Items for the Super Mech, as mentioned, are defensive based. Bramble Vest and Dragon's Claw are 2 default standard items you can play on the Super Mech every game to mitigate as much damage as possible. Warmog's Quicksilver and Guardian Angel are also viable options to use. Generally, you won't be giving many damage items to the Super Mech as it already does enough, but an okay item to grab for utility and a bit of damage is Ionic Spark. Look to place these items on either Rumble or Annie, since one or both of them is likely to be 3-starred later in the game. Next up, let's talk about Shaco items. Sword is the most important item for Shaco as it builds into basically every single item he wants. Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, and Guardian Angel are the best items to give him. It's also possible to stack either double Bloodthirster or double Infinity Edge if that's the components that the game gives you, but whichever of those 2 you're grabbing, the second item should always be a Guardian Angel. Outside of those 3, there's a few other viable options to give Shaco, such as Rapid Fire Cannon to help him chase down after enemies. Quicksilver will help ensure you don't get CC'd early in the fight, and lastly, some type of tier-based item like Seraph's or Hand of Justice can help him get his first ultimate off. Shaco is usually the best late-game carry for this composition, so prioritizing items for him is always worthwhile, which means on the early carousel rounds, you're going to be aiming for swords over other items. And lastly, we have Kaisa items which fall under magic and utility. Seraph's is by far the best option for her since it allows her to cast her ability early and more often in fights. After that, you can stack any number of AP items such as Death Cap or Jeweled Gauntlet, but if you're able to find a spatula or it appears on the carousel rounds, it can be extremely potent to turn Kaisa into a demolitionist. The reason being is that it makes each missile of her ability stun when it hits a champion. It won't overlap on the same target, but since her ability can hit multiple champions, it's going to get a lot of value. And if the game really isn't dropping you a lot of Kaisa items, but you have a leftover gloves, it's completely fine to just give her a Thieves Gloves as she uses them quite well. With the core items done, let's move on and talk about the core champions of Mech Infiltrator. The primary composition of Mech Infiltrator utilizes 6 core champions. Annie, Rumble, and Fizz are used for the mech pilot, with Shaco, Kaisa, and either Kha'Zix or Echo filling in the rest of the infiltrator spots. Those 6 champions are the standard variant of the build. From there, you can play a multitude of champions at level 7 and 8. Mystic is a common addition, with Lulu being quite a strong option at level 8. Darkstar can work well since it also gives you 2 sorcerers if you grab Lux. It's common to run Karma in that case to buff your Shaco or Kaisa with a shield, though you can also use any other Darkstar and place them in the front as fodder. 2 of the more standard traits to play will be Demolitionist to pair with your Rumble, which makes your Super Mech stun when its ability goes off, and Valkyrie to buff your Kaisa. Ziggs is a fine placeholder at level 7 until you find Gangplank later, and the same goes with Kale until you find a Misfortune. Generally, you're only going to play Valkyrie if you hit Kaisa 3 and she's your primary carry. What champions you play at level 7 and 8 is quite flexible, so don't overstress trying to find the perfect fit. Just play what you find and go from there. So that's the standard composition for Mech Infiltrator. A variant of this build uses only 2 infiltrators and goes more heavily into magic damage by aiming to get 4 sorcerers. This is viable when you're able to get Kaisa 3 as she's your primary carry with items. Since Annie is already a sorcerer, it makes filling in the rest quite easy, and the Super Mech gets a ton of value from bonus magic damage. The core champions of this variant are still Annie, Fizz, and Rumble for the mech pilot, with Kaisa as the second infiltrator. From there, any sorcerers are fine to add, though Lux, Zoe, and Syndra are strong options. Lux and Zoe provide decent CC, and Syndra is a great secondary carry if you have leftover items to give her. From there, you can look to play Gangplank at level 8 for Demolitionist, as he will CC a large portion portion of the board while doing good damage because of the 4 sorcerer buff. Alright, now we're done with the core items and champions. Let's go over each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. To begin, let's talk about the beginning carousel. As mentioned in the item section, sword is generally the best component to look for, as Shaco needs a lot of swords for his items. If you're unable to get a sword, look to grab either a tier, glove, or rod. For early game items, just make what the game gives you in regards to core items, as that will also help dictate your carry later in the game. The early game is quite simple, as you only have a few goals to keep track of. First, pick up any of the mech pilot and infiltrator champions, as getting to 3 mech, 4 infiltrator as quickly as possible is the most important goal of the comp. Kha'Zix can be your item holder at this stage of the game, since he's easily sold and replaced later on when you find the proper carries. There's a lot of viable early carries to grab to hold items, but Xayah in particular is great for physical damage, and Twisted Fate is fantastic for magic damage items. Defensive items can go on any frontline champion you find. The second goal in the early game is to make as much money as you can while trying to get to level 6 quickly. At the moment, the best way to do this is to either win streak or lose streak early to try to maximize your gold gained. If you have a strong start with a few 2-star champions and good items, you want to push this advantage by leveling early to 4 and 5. If you don't have a good early game, which means the items you can make are lackluster or you're not hitting any upgrades, it's best to try it and lose streak by playing the weakest board you can. Whichever streak you go to, try to maintain it until you get to Krugs. And the last goal, as stated, is to get to level 6 quickly. You want to do this with 50 gold, as you want to slow roll after you hit level 6, but the earlier you're able to hit level 6, the quicker you can get the full build online. Fizz is by far the hardest champion to find for this composition in the early game, and level 6 increases your chances to find him. To sum up the early game, look for mech pilot and infiltrator champions, get to 50 gold, and get to level 6. Now, let's venture forth into the mid-game. This stage of the game is where your build truly shines once you have the majority of your composition 2-starred. It may be hard to get Fizz 2, but as long as Annie and Rumble are level 2, it's gonna be okay. Mid-game begins around stage 3-2, and you'll either be level 6 by that stage or a few rounds after. Your goal at this point of the game is to be at 50 gold and slowly roll the excess each round to aim for 3-starring most of your board. Annie, Rumble, and depending on which items you have, either Shaco or Kaisa should be where you focus on rolling. Kha'Zix isn't important, and you don't need to look for a Fizz 3, as it's unlikely to happen in this build, and it's needlessly expensive. It's a good idea to scout around on Krugs 3-1 and 3-2 just to get an idea of who's contesting your champions. Shaco, for example, is a highly popular champion in the current meta, so it's not improbable for others to be buying him. If they are, it may be good to focus more on Kaisa as your main carry. It's also quite possible others will be contesting the mech pilot champions, and if that's the case, you can still look to 3-star them, but lean more towards Annie, since there's way more 2 costs in the pool than there are 3 costs. Overall, it's good to keep track of how many of your champions others are taking, as that gives you an idea of how long it may take to get them to level 3. Back to slow rolling. It's an easy concept to do, as you're just rolling the interest in passive gold each round and grabbing any relevant champions you find. You're trying not to dip below 50 gold, so it's usually not best to roll if you're at 52 gold, since you'll fall below the 50 mark if you hit any of the champions on that roll. On PvE rounds, you can wait until afterwards so you have a larger amount to roll with, though it's only best to do that if no one is contesting your champions. All in all, the goal of this stage is to hit Annie 3, Rumble 3, and either Shaco or Kaisa 3. All 4 are ideal, but as long as the 2 mech pilots are level 3 and your primary carry is level 3, you're in a good spot and you can start leveling. One last thing to keep in mind is that if you haven't hit everything you're looking for and the next round you'll naturally level to 7, then it's time to all in your gold and hit your upgrades. This must also be done if you're getting low on health, which is around 30 or so, as you don't want to lose the game sitting on 50 gold. Alright, let's talk a bit about the late game. By this stage of the game, which is generally stage 5 after Raptors, you should have most of your champions you've been rolling for at level 3. You're going to mostly be looking to level towards level 8 to fill in the rest of your composition. Legendaries are always worthwhile to grab, as Echo is the replacement for Kha'Zix, Gangplank is great for Demolitionist, and Lulo is just an overall solid champion. Misfortune is great since she gives Valkyrie as well. Not much else is that relevant for the late game in this build, as the bulk of what your goals are should be completed in the mid game. The last thing to touch on for this composition is positioning. Compared to a lot of builds, this composition isn't particularly complicated when it comes to positioning, but since infiltrators are quite flexible, you can do do quite a bit with them. Scout around to check where others are keeping important carries such as Jin, Kale, or Jinx, and have your primary carry match them to try to kill them as quickly as possible in the fight. If Kaisa is a demolitionist, try and position her in a way to stun the enemy carry while also getting as many other champions as possible to make the most out of the CC. It can even be beneficial to keep her near the front line to stun them if there's important champions like Gangplank there. For positioning the mech pilots, try to keep them in the second row so enemy champions move forward slightly but are still targeting the super mech. Always scout and be mindful of where enemies are placing their Zephyr, as it's a quick way to lose a fight if your super mech is lifted in the beginning. Quicksilver does negate that effect, but it's always important to scout for Zephyr. It can be beneficial to keep your Kha'Zix in the front to maneuver around if there's anyone using Zephyr, or use your level 7 or 8 champion to do that. Overall positioning of this comp is not complicated, just make sure you're scouting and adjusting where necessary. And that's the end of our how to play Mech Infiltrators video. We hope this helps you go out and climb ranked, though keep in mind that this composition is quite strong in the meta and it's likely that many others will try to play it as well. Let us know in the comment section below how your games have been with Mech Infiltrators and if there's any other builds that you'd like us to cover in the future. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.